This is The Locked Garden Gate, a Hercule Poirot mystery. Welcome back to The Little Grey Cells. I am Arthur Hastings, and thank you for joining me tonight on this journey into the heart of darkness. First, we would like to greatly thank our listeners from all over the world. If you are joining us for the first time, we invite you to subscribe and write a comment telling us where you are from. Some things are better kept out or in. Dim your lights, Poirot yourself a tisane, and prepare to exercise your own grey cells. Chapter 1. The Theatre of Fools. "I have been deceived," said Hercule Poirot. He stood at the entrance to the drawing-room of Hawthorn Grange and surveyed the scene before him with the expression of a man who has ordered champagne and received lukewarm water. The room was large, the ceilings high, and the ancestors on the walls suitably grim. These details were all as advertised. It was everything else that gave him pause. A napkin, folded, if one were to be charitable, into something resembling a swan, though a swan evidently assembled in conditions of great haste, sat at a slight angle upon the nearest side table. Poirot corrected it with 2 fingers as he passed. Beside it, a vase of carnations listed perceptibly to the left. He did not correct the vase. He merely observed it and filed the observation away in that immaculate mental cabinet that his friends called a mind, and his enemies called something rather less polite. His host for the weekend, the term host applied only in the technical sense, done as one might apply it to a particularly aggressive bacterium, had been described to him by his acquaintance fellows as a woman of the most exquisite refinement. Fellows was a man who used words with careless generosity and absolutely no regard for their accuracy. Lady Imogen Hawthorn, when she descended upon Poirot approximately 30 seconds later, was a woman of perhaps 60, formidably upright, with the sort of face that appeared to have been designed for the purpose of expressing mild dissatisfaction. She wore grey silk with the confidence of someone who had never in her life been uncertain about anything, and she rearranged a small porcelain figurine on the mantelpiece within seconds of entering the room. "Monsieur Poirot." Her voice was precisely calibrated, warm enough to indicate welcome, cool enough to indicate limits. "How very good of you to come. I hope your journey was not too dreadful." "It was," said Poirot pleasantly. "Most instructive. The countryside is very green." "It generally is in June." She looked at him with the faint appraisal of a woman accustomed to sizing up the social utility of new arrivals, then appeared to conclude that a famous Belgian detective would do well enough for a weekend. "You will want to see your room. Higgins will take your things." He was guided upstairs by a young footman with the distracted expression of a man bracing perpetually for catastrophe. An expression which, as Poirot was shortly to discover, was entirely appropriate to the circumstances of Hawthorn Grange. The other guests had already arrived, and they made themselves known to him at the pre-dinner gathering in the garden. It was a perfect English summer evening. Roses of such disciplined perfection they seemed almost threatening, hedges trimmed with military severity, and at the far end of a long yew maze, a gate, heavy, iron, locked, through which one could see only shadows and the suggestion of wilderness beyond. "Symbolic," Lady Imogen said when she observed Poirot's gaze resting upon it. She did not elaborate. She had the manner of a woman to whom elaboration is a form of weakness. Basil Trent introduced himself with great enthusiasm, and a laugh deployed approximately 3 seconds before the joke it was meant to accompany. He was a large man, florid, expensively dressed, with a particular confidence of someone who had never required approval, but had always managed to obtain it nonetheless. "The famous detective!" he boomed, seizing Poirot's hand. "Capital, capital! What a weekend this shall be!" He winked at his own observation. "Provided no one turns up dead, eh?" His wife, Celia, smiled at this in a way that did not reach her eyes. She was a thin, fair woman with beautiful manners and the habit of finishing other people's sentences in a manner that suggested she had considered theirs and found them slightly inadequate. "What Basil means," she said, "is that we are all delighted you could join us." She had the look, Poirot thought, of someone who has been watching very carefully for a very long time. Oliver Dane announced himself primarily through the volume of his presence. He wore a jacket the colour of French mustard and carried a leather-bound notebook which he consulted with great frequency, though he wrote nothing in it. He was Lady Imogen's landscape designer. Or rather, he had been, until what he referred to with theatrical bitterness as the arrangement. "You see the maze?" he said to Poirot, gesturing expansively. "The configuration of those paths, the rhythm, the restraint, that is my composition. Every sightline was calculated." He paused. "Naturally, someone else takes the credit." Lady Imogen, 3 feet away, appeared to hear nothing. Miss Prudence Vale occupied the corner of the garden nearest the roses and spoke to no one until spoken to. She was perhaps 50, dressed with the quiet self-effacement of a woman who has decided that invisibility is the most comfortable posture. When Poirot introduced himself, she looked at him with grey eyes that were, he noticed, entirely alert. "Yes," she said. "I know who you are." She said nothing further. She had, he thought, the manner of someone who has long since decided that most conversation is a poor investment. She was Lady Imogen's companion, he was subsequently informed by the footman. A companion. The word settled into Poirot's mind and sat there, unremarkable, while he filed away the more interesting fact. That Miss Vale had, in the space of their 30-second acquaintance, said exactly as much as she wished to say, and not one syllable more. Dr. Stephen Harrow arrived last, having apparently been detained by what he described as a matter requiring precision. He was lean and dry, with the slightly exasperated air of a man who has spent 40 years in proximity to human irrationality and has never entirely resigned himself to it. "Poirot," he said, and with a nod that suggested he found the Belgian's reputation adequate, though perhaps overstated. "Harrow, family physician, 30 years. He spoke in the manner of a man submitting evidence. Dinner was announced at 8 o'clock, and it was at dinner that the first note was struck. The note that, Poirot would later reflect, had been vibrating beneath the cheerful surface of the evening from the very beginning. Basil Trent rose for a speech. He was the sort of man for whom speeches were a natural expression of well-being, in the way that song is natural to certain birds. He spoke of the garden, of cultivation, of the satisfactions of a fine estate well maintained. He spoke of growth and pruning. He was quite good in his way. There was laughter. Lady Imogen smiled thinly at the head of the table. Whodunit then, apparently struck by a thought of great amusement, he turned and gestured toward the darkened end of the garden, where the yew maze and its locked gate sat beyond the candle-lit windows. "Some things," he said with a grin of enormous self-satisfaction, "are better kept out or in." There was laughter. There was always laughter at Basil Trent's jokes. But Poirot, whose little grey eyes had been moving quietly around the table throughout the speech, observed the following. Celia Trent laughed with a brightness that was fractionally too emphatic. Miss Vale's spoon struck her bowl with a small, sharp sound and remained there, motionless. Lady Imogen said with a precision that was indistinguishable from fury, "Don't be absurd, Basil." And Oliver Dane, staring at the tablecloth, murmured, to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone, "Yes, lock things do have a way of staying buried." No one responded to this. The conversation moved, as English dinner conversation always does, sideways and onward, towards safer ground. The roses were admired. The weather was discussed. A general consensus was reached that the summer had been, on balance, satisfactory. Hercule Poirot ate his soup, which was excellent, and said very little. He had come to Hawthorn Grange under the impression that the weekend would be orderly, refined, and without incident. He revised this impression. Chapter 2. The Art of Being Overlooked. The morning after a dinner party is, in Poirot's experience, invariably more revealing than the dinner itself. At dinner, people perform. They select their words, arrange their expressions, and deploy their personalities with the care of a host setting out the best china. But the morning strips all that away. In the morning, people are merely themselves, a condition which many of them find deeply inconvenient. Poirot descended at 8:30, having devoted 45 minutes to his toilette with the seriousness it deserved. He found the breakfast room in a state of careful avoidance. Celia Trent sat at one end of the table with a cup of tea and a letter she was reading, with slightly too much concentration. Oliver Dane occupied a chair near the window, staring into the garden as though it had personally offended him. Lady Imogen had not yet appeared. Miss Vale was nowhere to be seen. The absence of Basil Trent was not in itself remarkable. Men of Basil's constitution frequently required a longer recovery from their own sociability. What was perhaps mildly notable was that his chair had been pushed back at an angle as though he had risen in some haste, and a half-consumed cup of coffee sat beside his place, cold. Poirot noted this. He said nothing. He applied himself to his eggs, which were acceptably prepared, and waited. Dr. Harrow appeared at 9:15, poured himself coffee without greeting anyone, and positioned himself with his back to the room, a posture that announced, as clearly as any words, that he was not available for conversation. He stood at the sideboard for a moment and then said, quite suddenly, and to no one in particular, "Has anyone seen Trent this morning?" The question landed in the room with a peculiar weight. Celia looked up from her letter. Oliver turned from the window. The quality of the silence that followed was not the silence of ignorance, but the silence of people deciding what to say. "He went out early," Celia said at last. "He often does." She returned her eyes to the letter. Her voice had been entirely even, and it was the evenness that Poirot found interesting. "Into the garden," said Harrow. "I expect so." There was a pause of perhaps 5 seconds. Then Harrow set down his coffee cup and, without another word, walked out through the French doors. Poirot continued eating. Oliver Dane watched the garden. Celia read her letter. It was Miss Prudence Vale who found him. She had come in through the side entrance. the servants' entrance in point of fact, though no one remarked upon this. At 9:12, and she had said, in a voice of perfect steadiness, "I think someone ought to come." That was all. She did not say what she had found, or where, or in what condition. She stood in the doorway with her hands folded and waited for someone to respond. It was Poirot who rose. The body of Basil Trent lay at the edge of the yew maze, perhaps 12 feet from the locked gate. He was face down, one arm extended, the fingers of his right hand curled in the soil, as though he had attempted, at the last, to grasp something. His face, when they turned him, held an expression that had nothing to do with the easy expansiveness of the night before. It was the face of a man who had been very frightened and had not had sufficient time to become anything else. "Heart," said Harrow, almost before he had knelt down. He said it with the firmness of a man producing a fact rather than forming a conclusion. "He had a weak heart. I have been telling him for 2 years." "Indeed," said Poirot. He was looking at the soil around the body. The path was dry. It had not rained in 4 days. But the area near the gate was slightly darker, as though something had been spilled. He did not mention this. He looked at Basil's nails, at the state of his shoes, at the particular way his jacket had caught on the lower branch of the nearest yew. He noticed all of these things, and he said none of them. "Poor fellow," said Oliver Dane from a distance of approximately 8 feet. He had followed them out, but had stopped well short of the body, and there was something in his posture, not grief precisely, but a studied approximation of it, that Poirot catalogued without comment. The gate was still locked. Poirot examined the keyhole with a brief, concentrated attention, then straightened and turned to look back at the house. From this position, the breakfast-room windows were visible. The angle was such that anyone standing here would have been clearly observable from inside. And conversely, anyone inside would have been clearly visible from here. No one had mentioned seeing Basil walk towards the maze. Lady Imogen arrived in the garden at 9:20, summoned by the footman with a discretion that had not prevented her from dressing with complete formality. She looked at the body of Basil Trent with an expression that Poirot would have described as controlled fury at the inconvenience of it, rather than sorrow. She said, "This is most unfortunate," in the tone a general might employ upon discovering that the wrong ridge had been taken. "You will wish to telephone the police," said Poirot gently. The police. She said the word as though he had proposed inviting them for the weekend, which, in a sense, he had. "Is that quite necessary? Stephen has said—" "Dr. Harrow has offered a hypothesis," said Poirot. "A hypothesis is not a verdict, madame." She looked at him for a moment. Her eyes were very pale, very steady, and entirely unreadable. Then she said, "Very well," and walked back toward the house with the bearing of a woman who has conceded a point, but not an argument. Poirot remained beside the maze. The others drifted back in the wake of Lady Imogen, drawn by the social gravity that kept them always in orbit around her. In a matter of moments, only Miss Vale remained. She was looking at the gate. "Miss Vale," said Poirot in a conversational tone, "you found him at what time?" 9:00, perhaps a minute or two after. She did not look at him. "I walk in the garden each morning. I have done so for 11 years. The same path, always the same. And you observed nothing unusual before you found him? No sound in the night, no movement?" She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone deciding whether to answer, but the quiet of someone choosing which truth to offer. "I heard the gate," she said at last. "At some point in the night, a sound of metal." She paused. "I did not look at the clock. I thought it was the wind." Poirot inclined his head. "The gate," he said thoughtfully, "which is locked." Miss Vale turned to look at him then, and in her grey eyes there was something that he had not seen in the eyes of any other person present that morning. It was not fear, it was not calculation, it was something older and quieter than either of those things. "Yes," she said, "the gate which is locked." She left him standing there, and Poirot turned once more to look at the lock, at the soil, at the cold, still shape of Basil Trent. Above him, the June sky was very blue. A thrush was singing somewhere in the yew. The joke, he thought, had stopped being funny. Chapter 3. The joke that stopped being funny. Inspector Graves arrived from the village at 11:30, which gave the household approximately 2 hours in which to arrange itself into its preferred version of innocence. He was a competent man in the way that provincial policemen sometimes are, thorough or unhurried, possessed of a solid respect for facts and a solid suspicion of anything that did not immediately resemble one. He shook Poirot's hand with the careful courtesy of a man who has been informed by telephone that a famous detective is on the premises and has decided to treat this information as an administrative complication rather than an asset. "Natural causes," he said after examining the body with Dr. Harrow at his elbow. "Heart, most likely. Coroner will confirm." "No doubt," said Poirot. Graves looked at him. "You have some objection, Monsieur Poirot?" "I have no objection whatsoever, mon ami. I merely have observations. Whether they constitute an objection, that is a matter for the coroner, as you say." He smiled with great pleasantness. "The soil near the gate, the condition of the fingernails, the angle at which Monsieur Trent's jacket was caught upon the yew. These are small things. Very possibly they mean nothing at all." Graves wrote something in his notebook. His expression suggested that he found Poirot only marginally less troublesome than the corpse. The body was removed at noon. Luncheon was served at 1 because Lady Imogen was the sort of woman for whom the suspension of meal times would have constituted a second catastrophe. It was, by any measure, a remarkable meal. The food was excellent. The conversation was not so much strained as architectural, each sentence carefully constructed to bear weight without revealing its foundations. Celia Trent ate with perfect appetite and spoke of roses. Oliver Dane pushed food around his plate and said that the proportions of the dining room were, compositionally, rather too symmetrical. Dr. Harrow corrected a minor factual error in something Lady Imogen said about the properties of yew, and then appeared to regret having spoken at all. Lady Imogen presided. She always presided. It was, Poirot reflected, the single activity at which she was entirely and unself-consciously herself. He waited until the table had been cleared before he began. "Lady Imogen." He found her in the morning room at 2:30, rearranging a bowl of sweet peas with the concentrated attention of a woman who has decided that the sweet peas require her full focus and everything else in the world does not. "I wonder if I might impose upon your time for a few moments." She set down a stem of pale lilac. "You're going to ask me questions." "I am going to ask everyone questions. You have the distinction of being first." She sat. It was, he noticed, the chair nearest the door. not through any intention perhaps, but the instinct of a woman accustomed to maintaining proximity to exits. Very well. He asked her about the evening, about the speech, about the gate. She answered each question with the clipped precision of someone who has rehearsed not the answers, but the manner of answering. A subtly different thing, and one that Poirot found considerably more interesting than careless candour would have been. "The gate," he said, "has been locked for how long?" "Years, a great many years." "And the key?" "Kept in the estate office. It is not a matter of general access." She paused fractionally. "As I said, naturally." Poirot looked at his hands. "I ask only because the lock shows signs of recent use. The keyhole is, shall we say, fresher than the gate that surrounds it. A small thing." He looked up. "Perhaps the gardeners." "The gardeners have no reason to use that gate." "No," agreed Poirot pleasantly. "I thought not." Lady Imogen looked at him with those pale, steady eyes. A muscle in her jaw performed the briefest of movements. "Monsieur Poirot, my guest has died. It is a tragedy, but I would ask you not to construct complications where none exist." "Madame," said Poirot with great sincerity, "I construct nothing. I merely look at what is already there." She had nothing to say to this, and so she said nothing, which was, in its way, the most informative response she had yet offered. Celia Trent was in the garden when he found her, standing near the herbaceous border with a pair of gloves she was not wearing, eye looking at something that was not the flowers. Mrs. Trent. He approached at a measured pace, giving her time to compose herself. She did so with remarkable speed. "I am so sorry for your loss. Your husband was a most vivid personality." "He was," she said. Then, after a moment, "Vivid. Yes, that is the word." There was something in her agreement, a faint, careful quality, that suggested she was confirming a fact rather than endorsing a compliment. Poirot took note of it and moved on. "The speech last night," he said. "I wonder if you could help me understand it a little better. Your husband spoke of pruning undesirable elements. It was, one felt, a remark with particular application." She turned to look at him directly. She had, he thought, the eyes of someone who is accustomed to watching and has had reason to be. Basil enjoyed being clever at other people's expense. It was a habit. She paused. "I don't say it unkindly." And the gesture towards the gate? Theatre. Basil was always theatrical. "Indeed, but the reaction of your companions—" "People are nervous when a man of Basil's position makes jokes," she said evenly. "He had influence over several people at that table. When such men joke about unpleasant things, others find it difficult to laugh quite naturally." It was an acute observation, delivered with perfect composure. Too perfect, thought Poirot. He tried a different angle. "You were yourself acquainted with Lady Imogen's son, I believe, before his death." The gloves in her hands became, very briefly, still. Then she drew them through her fingers with a slow, deliberate motion. "We were friendly, yes, a long time ago. A great sadness, his death. A great sadness," she agreed. Her voice had lost a fraction of its smoothness, the way fine silk will catch almost imperceptibly on a rough surface. "It was a long time ago," she said again, as though repetition could make the past more distant. Poirot thanked her and took his leave. Oliver Dane was the easiest interview of the afternoon, in the sense that interviewing him required very little effort on Poirot's part. He simply asked a single question and stood back. "Tell me about the garden design." What followed lasted 22 minutes. Poirot listened with every appearance of absorbed interest, while Dane described with increasing vehemence the history of the Hawthorn Grange maze, his original conception, the appropriation of his plans, the credit accorded to another designer entirely, and the systematic refusal of Lady Imogen to acknowledge any of this. "And Monsieur Tron?" said Poirot, when Dane paused for breath. Dane's expression shifted. "What about him?" "He was aware of your grievance, I take it." Trent was aware of everything that suited him. He said it with a bitterness that had been thoroughly aged. He thought it was amusing. He collected other people's difficulties the way some men collect stamps. "You were in the garden last night," said Poirot. "After dinner." A pause. "I went for a walk. I often do. I find the night air clarifies the mind." "And you saw nothing?" "I saw the garden." He met Poirot's eyes with a steadiness that was slightly in excess of what the question required. Nothing else. Poirot thanked him with great warmth and reflected, as he walked back toward the house, that Oliver Dane was a man performing guilt with the enthusiasm of someone who wants very badly to be suspected, and that this was, paradoxically, the most compelling evidence so far that he was not guilty of anything at all. He found Miss Vale in the corridor outside the library. She was carrying a book she had not been reading. The spine was uncracked, and she looked at him with the expression of someone who has been waiting, but is not about to say so. "Miss Vale," said Poirot quietly, "there is something you wish to tell me." She glanced toward the closed door of the library. Then she said, in a voice barely above a murmur, "The gate isn't to keep people out." She walked on before he could reply. So Poirot stood in the corridor and looked at the closed door for a long moment. Behind it, someone was moving. A soft, deliberate sound, like a person replacing a book they had not meant to be found reading. The house, he thought, was full of things kept carefully behind closed doors, and at least one of them was no longer safe. Chapter 4. Behind every smile, a knife. The library door, when Poirot opened it, revealed nothing more dramatic than an empty room, or rather, a room that gave every impression of having been recently vacated. The fire, unlit at this time of year, had nevertheless been attended to. The grate was clean, but a faint scatter of ash on the hearthstone suggested that something had been burned within the last day or two. A chair near the writing desk was positioned at a slight angle to the table, the kind of angle produced not by casual use, but by someone rising from it with some haste. On the desk itself, a blotter bore the ghostly impression of handwriting, recent enough to be legible if one took the trouble to look at it from the correct angle in the correct light, which Poirot proceeded to do with the small pocket mirror he habitually carried. 2 words were recoverable. The rest was obscured by subsequent writing or by intent. The words were, "Tell him." Poirot replaced his mirror, considered the cold grate, and left the library precisely as he had found it. He had a long-established principle regarding the disturbance of evidence. One observed, one noted, and one returned later when the relevant party had had sufficient time to believe themselves unobserved. Patience, in his experience, was a more reliable instrument than confrontation. He spent the remainder of the afternoon in the manner most likely to be underestimated by the household. That is to say, he was visibly idle. He sat in the garden. He admired the roses with apparent sincerity. He accepted a cup of tea from the footman and consumed it with every sign of a man whose principal concern was its temperature. and he listened. It is a curious fact about households under strain that they produce, in the spaces between performances, a great deal of accidental honesty. Whispered exchanges at the end of corridors, half-sentences abandoned when a third person appears. The particular silence that falls when a room realizes it has been joined by someone it had not expected. All of these, to Poirot, were as legible as text. At 4 o'clock, he heard Lady Imogen say to Dr. Harrow in the corridor outside the morning room, "It must be heart. You have said so. That is sufficient." And Harrow's reply, lower, with a quality of resistance in it. "Imogen, if they perform a proper examination, then they will find what they find." Her voice was a closed door. "You will not elaborate your observations to the inspector. There is nothing to elaborate." A pause, then footsteps, Harrow's, moving away. Poirot, seated in a garden chair visible from the corridor window, continued to admire the roses. At 4:30, he requested a private conversation with Dr. Harrow, and they walked together along the gravel path that circled the formal garden, far enough from the house for privacy, near enough that the walk itself appeared unremarkable. Harrow was, Poirot had concluded, and a fundamentally honest man placed in an uncomfortable proximity to dishonesty. Such men develop over time a particular kind of tension. They cannot lie outright, and so they practice the more sophisticated art of saying accurate things that create inaccurate impressions. It is, in many ways, more difficult than straightforward deception, and considerably more exhausting. "You have been the family physician for 30 years, said Poirot. "That is a long confidence to hold." "It is a professional relationship," said Harrow. "Nothing more." "Of course. And professionally, Monsieur Trent's heart. It was, as you say, a matter of long-standing concern." He had been warned repeatedly. He ignored it, as such men generally do. His colour last evening, his appetite, these were consistent with a man in poor cardiac health. Harrow was quiet for 3 steps. They were not inconsistent with it. Poirot smiled at a rose. "That is very precisely put, Doctor." A longer silence. The gravel crunched evenly beneath their feet. "There was something about Trent's expression," said Harrow at last, with the reluctance of a man paying a debt he had hoped to defer. "When we turned him, it was—" He stopped. "Fear, one might say. But extreme fear can produce cardiac arrest. It is not uncommon." "Fear of what, I wonder?" "Of dying," said Harrow crisply. "Men are frequently afraid of dying, Monsieur Poirot. It requires no further explanation." But his pace, Poirot noted, had increased slightly. Men whose arguments satisfied them did not, as a rule, walk faster. He found Celia Trent at 5 o'clock in the small sitting room that the household appeared to have designated, by unspoken consent, as the room for private distress. She had been crying, though she had stopped some time before he arrived, and she received him with a composure that he respected without entirely believing. He did not ask her about grief. He had observed her sufficiently to understand that the direct approach with this particular woman produced the best constructed defences. Instead, he sat and remarked in a tone of mild curiosity, "Your husband altered his will recently. I wonder if you could tell me something of that." The composure held, but differently. "Where did you hear that?" "One hears things." He left it there, a gentle vacancy for her to fill. She looked at her hands. They were, he noticed, quite steady. He changed certain provisions 3 weeks ago. I was informed, not consulted." a beat. That was Basil's method with most things. The alterations, were they to your disadvantage? To mine and to others. She looked up. Before you ask, yes, I knew. And yes, it made me angry. And no, that has nothing to do with this. She said it flatly, as one states a fact that one is tired of defending. I believe you, said Poirot. And he did, in the main. The absence of guilt in her voice was genuine. What was present was something more complex, more weathered. The particular anguish of someone who has carried a difficult knowledge alone for a long time and has been given no legitimate occasion to set it down. Lady Imogen's son, he said gently. His name was Edmund. Her stillness was answer enough. He died 4 years ago, said Poirot, under circumstances described as accidental. They were described as accidental, said Celia. Yes. And Monsieur Trant, he was acquainted with the circumstances? She stood. It was not a dramatic movement. It was the movement of a woman who has reached the limit of what she's prepared to say in a single conversation. Basil was acquainted, she said carefully, with a great many things that other people would have preferred him not to know. She moved toward the door, then paused. He found it useful, being acquainted with such things. She left. Poirot remained in the sitting room for a moment, arranging in his mind the pieces he now possessed. Basil Trent had known something about Edmund Hawthorn's death. He had held that knowledge and deployed it, quietly and over years, as a financial and social instrument. The estate's delicate finances had been stabilized by Trent's assistance. The nature of that assistance was becoming to Poirot considerably clearer. And then Basil had made his speech, his laughing, theatrical, thoroughly satisfied speech about locked gates and buried things, in front of the precise people who needed him silent. That speech had not been careless. Poirot was increasingly convinced of this. It had been a demonstration, a public exercise of power delivered in the guise of wit, the sort of thing a man does when he feels entirely secure. And security, in Poirot's considerable experience, was the precise condition that made a man most vulnerable. He rose, straightened the antimacassar on the chair behind him, and walked out into the corridor. Though the house was quiet in the particular way of houses that are holding their breath. Somewhere above him, a floorboard registered a careful footstep, and then went silent. Poirot stood at the foot of the staircase and looked upward for a moment. Then he went to dress for dinner because some things, whatever the circumstances, remained non-negotiable. Chapter 5. The Garden as a Map of Secrets. Dinner that evening was served at 8, as it had been the night before, with the same silver, the same arrangement of glasses, and a conspicuous absence where Basil Trent had sat. Lady Imogen had not removed the chair. This struck Poirot as deliberate, whether as a gesture of respect or as a statement that the household continued regardless. He could not yet determine. Possibly both. Lady Imogen was not a woman who wasted gestures. The conversation, such as it was, moved with the effortful brightness of people who have agreed, without discussion, to say nothing of importance. Oliver Dane offered a lengthy meditation on the relationship between topiary and moral philosophy. Dr. Harrow ate in near silence and twice refilled his wineglass in a manner that suggested the wine was doing something useful. Celia Trent was a model of social grace, attentive, responsive, entirely absent in every way that mattered. It was, Poirot reflected, an almost perfect performance of a household that had nothing to hide, which was, of course, the surest possible indication that it had a great deal. He excused himself before the port was poured. The night was clear, and the air carrying that particular quality of English June evenings that smells of cut grass and something faintly unresolved. Poirot walked with his hands behind his back and his eyes moving steadily across the garden. He had no torch. The moon provided sufficient illumination for a man who was not, in any case, looking at the ground. He was looking at the sight lines. Oliver Dane had said, with the bitterness of a man reciting a private catechism, that every sight line in the maze had been calculated. He had meant it as an aesthetic declaration. But a sight line, Poirot reflected, was a symmetrical thing. What it permitted one to see, it equally permitted one to be seen from. The maze paths did not merely guide movement. They controlled visibility with the precision of a stage set. He walked the perimeter of the maze slowly. From the first corner, the drawing-room windows were visible. From the second, the morning room. From the third corner, the one nearest the locked gate, one could observe almost the entirety of the garden's east-facing aspect, including the door through which the household habitually passed to take the air after dinner. But from within the maze itself, approaching the gate, one could not be seen from the house at all. This was not accidental. Poirot was quite certain of that now. He examined the gate a second time in the moonlight. The lock was a heavy iron mechanism, Victorian in origin, the sort that required a substantial key. He had borrowed the key from the estate office that afternoon on a pretext of mild administrative interest. And Lady Imogen's secretary, a young woman of limited curiosity, had produced it without difficulty. He had noted at the time that there was a faint deposit of soil in the key's collar. Not old soil, compacted and dark. Fresh soil, pale and slightly damp. Someone had used this key and returned it, recently. He unlocked the gate and stepped through. Beyond lay what had once, some decades ago, been a kitchen garden. It had been left to its own inclinations for long enough that nature had made considerable editorial decisions. But it was not, as the locked gate and Lady Imogen's manner had implied, simply abandoned. Someone had been here. A path of sorts had been kept clear through the undergrowth, not formally maintained, but used regularly enough that the growth had learned to accommodate it. At the far end, the half-consumed by climbing bramble, stood a small stone building, a former tool store, its door secured by a padlock that was, unlike the gate, very new indeed. Poirot looked at the padlock for a long moment, his head tilted at the precise angle that indicated the engagement of what he privately called the deeper consideration. Then he turned and retraced his steps, relocked the gate, and stood in the maze for a moment with his eyes closed. Someone wanted it to appear that nothing lay beyond the gate. They had maintained this fiction for years, apparently with great success. Basil Trent, joking about locked things staying buried, had understood something about what lay beyond. And now, Basil was dead, and whatever lay beyond remained hidden. The gate, Miss Vale had said, was not to keep people out. He was crossing the lawn toward the house when he encountered Celia Trent on the terrace. She was standing with a shawl drawn around her shoulders, looking not at the garden, but at the sky. The posture of someone who has come outside not for the air, but for the privacy. Poirot did not announce himself dramatically. He simply arrived beside her, and after a moment she acknowledged him with a slight turn of her head. "You were in the garden," she said. Not an accusation, an observation. "A habit of mine. I find the night air assists the little grey cells." He paused. "You could not sleep, madame." "I never sleep well in other people's houses." She was quiet for a moment. "That is not entirely true. I used to sleep very well here." The admission appeared to surprise her slightly, as admissions sometimes do. "You came here often, before your marriage?" "Once or twice. Edmund was—" She stopped, began again, more carefully. "We were young. This house was different then, lighter." She drew the shawl closer. "That is a foolish thing to say about a house." "Not at all," said Poirot. "Houses absorb what happens in them. One feels it sometimes, very strongly." She turned to look at him with an attention that was different from the careful regard she had offered in the sitting-room. More direct, less defended. "You know about Edmund?" "I know that he died. I know that it was called an accident. I know that Basil knew something more than that, and that this knowledge was useful to him." She let out a breath that was not quite a sigh and not quite a laugh. "Basil was extraordinarily gifted at finding things out, and extraordinarily comfortable with the implications of knowing them." She looked back at the sky. "Edmund's death was not a simple accident. There were circumstances. Lady Imogen dealt with those circumstances in the way she deals with everything she cannot control. She managed them. She paid for silence where silence was available to be purchased, and Basil, who had been advising the estate financially at the time, became aware of what had been paid and to whom." Poirot said nothing. The silence was carefully calibrated to continue. "He never threatened anyone directly," she said. "That was rather the genius of it. He simply remained close, remained helpful, allowed the awareness of what he knew to do its work without ever being stated." She paused. "I believe he considered it a gentleman's arrangement. He would have been baffled to hear it described otherwise." "And you," said Poirot quietly, "you knew of this arrangement?" "I was his wife for 14 years, Monsieur Poirot. One becomes fluent in a language one would rather not have learned." The acknowledgement hung between them in the mild night air. Poirot looked at the dark shape of the yew maze, at the locked gate invisible within it, at the stone wall beyond which something was secured with a bright new padlock. "There is one thing more," he said with the care of a man placing the final weight upon a scale. "The night Basil died. You said he went out early. But your room, I took the liberty of noting it during the house tour Lady Imogen arranged yesterday morning, faces the garden directly." She was very still. "Did you see him go?" said Poirot. "Or did you see something else?" The pause that followed was the longest she had allowed herself. When she spoke, her voice was entirely level, which cost her, he could see, considerable effort. "I saw him meet someone at the entrance to the maze," she said. "At midnight. I did not see who it was. They were in the shadow of the hedge." She turned to face him fully. "I said nothing because I did not know then that it mattered." "And now?" "And now," said Celia Trent, "I think it matters very much." She went inside. Poirot remained on the terrace looking at the maze, while the last of the drawing-room lights went out one by one, and the house settled into the dark with the slow deliberateness of something that had been keeping secrets for a very long time and had no intention of stopping. Chapter 6 was what the locked room remembers. The padlock yielded at 7 o'clock the following morning. Poirot had spent a portion of the previous evening in quiet correspondence with a locksmith in the village, whose professional discretion he had secured with the combination of a considerable fee and a certain amount of personal charm. The man arrived at the garden gate at 6:45, examined the padlock with the respectful attention of a craftsman encountering another craftsman's work, and had it open in 4 minutes. He departed without having asked a single question. Poirot found this admirable. The stone building beyond the bramble path was small, perhaps 12 feet by 10, and it smelled of earth and dry wood and something else beneath those, faintly chemical, faintly botanical, in the way that old dispensaries sometimes smell. The walls were lined on 2 sides with shelving. Most of the shelves were empty or held the accumulated debris of decades: rusted hand tools, clay pots in various states of dissolution, seed catalogues from the previous century. But one shelf was not empty, and it was not old. A row of small glass bottles, perhaps a dozen in total, sat in careful order against the back wall. They were clean. Several were new. Beside them, in a wooden trug that had been recently scrubbed, lay a collection of dried plant material: stems, leaves, small clusters of berries, which Poirot examined without touching, his hands behind his back, his eyes performing the detailed work. He recognized from a case some years previously that had involved a rather creative pharmacist in Bruges, the dried foliage of Taxus baccata. English yew, an extraordinarily common in English gardens, and extraordinarily toxic in all of its components with the sole exception of the fleshy outer coating of its berry. He recognized several of the other specimens too, though he did not immediately name them, even to himself. The naming could wait. The understanding was already in place, assembling itself with the quiet efficiency of a well-ordered mechanism. He looked at the bottles. He did not open them. He photographed them with the small camera he carried in his breast pocket, replaced the padlock as he had found it, open as it now was, and walked back through the gate and along the maze paths and into the house in time for breakfast. He ate with excellent appetite, and the morning arranged itself around him with the now familiar tension of a household that has not yet found a way to be ordinary again. Inspector Graves had telephoned to say that the coroner's preliminary report would be available by the afternoon. Lady Imogen received this news in the morning room and emerged from it with an expression of such calibrated composure that Poirot concluded she was either entirely innocent or entirely prepared, and had not yet determined which. He had one interview remaining that he considered essential, and he had been, with deliberate patience, saving it. Miss Prudence Vale was in the library when he found her. She was, on this occasion, actually reading a botanical encyclopedia of considerable age and evident use, its spine reinforced with what appeared to be surgical tape. She did not look up when he entered, which meant either that she had not heard him or that she had heard him perfectly, and had decided that looking up was a form of encouragement she was not prepared to offer. Poirot sat down in the chair across from her and waited. After approximately 90 seconds, she closed the book. She did not mark her page. He noted this. A woman who knew precisely where she had been and had no need of external reminders. "You have been to the building beyond the gate," she said. It was not a question. He regarded this without surprise. "You saw me return this morning." "I see most things from my window. It faces east." She set the book on the table beside her. Her hands, he observed, were steady in the way of someone who has decided upon steadiness as a policy, rather than experiencing it as a natural condition. "I have been wondering when you would go. You knew what was there. I have known for some time. And you said nothing. To whom should I have said it?" The question was delivered without bitterness, but with a precision that carried the weight of a long-considered conclusion. Lady Imogen would have had it removed and denied its existence. Dr. Harrow would have found a professional framework in which it became unremarkable. And the others, she stopped. They each have their own difficulties. Poirot looked at her with the particular quality of attention he reserved for the moments when the architecture of a thing began to reveal itself. "You have been invisible in this house for 11 years, Miss Vale. That is a very long time to observe people who believe themselves unobserved." "It is," she said simply. "One learns a great deal. Tell me about Edmund." She was quiet for long enough that he wondered briefly whether she would. Then she folded her hands in her lap with a deliberateness that suggested she was organizing something considerably more significant than her posture. "Edmund Hawthorn was 26 when he died," she said. "He was not a robust young man. He was gentle, rather bookish, entirely unsuited to the role that had been mapped out for him since birth. Lady Imogen loved him in the way she loves most things, as an extension of her own design." She paused. "He was unhappy. That is the simple version. And the complete version. He had discovered something about the estate finances. What about the means by which Lady Imogen had maintained the Hawthorn Grange in the manner to which it considered itself entitled? There were arrangements that did not bear scrutiny, not criminal precisely, but the sort of thing that becomes criminal by degrees." She glanced towards the window. "He intended to make those arrangements public. Lady Imogen could not permit that." "You are saying she—" "I am saying nothing of the sort." Her voice was level. "Edmund died of a fall in this very house, the stairs in the east wing, in the early hours of a November morning. It was, as everyone agreed, a tragic accident." A pause. "I was the one who found him." The room received this in silence. Poirot looked at the botanical encyclopedia and at the surgical tape on its spine, and thought about a woman who repairs things carefully and keeps them close. "You were his confidant," said Poirot. "He had very few people in whom he could confide. I was available, I was trustworthy, and I was—" She said the next word with a dryness that contained multitudes. "Negligible. People say things in front of the negligible that they would never say in front of someone who counted." "And what did you hear in those days before his death?" "I heard Basil Trent assure Edmund, over 2 evenings of conversation in this very room, that the financial arrangements were entirely normal, that Edmund had misunderstood them, that making any sort of public statement would cause irreparable harm to people Edmund cared for." She looked at Poirot directly. "And I heard Edmund say on the last evening before he died, that he had written it all down and given it to someone for safekeeping." "That document was never produced." "No," said Miss Vale, "it was not." Poirot thought of the blotter in the library. Tell him. He thought of Celia Trent, who had once been close to Edmund, who had been at Hawthorn Grange in those days, who had received, perhaps, something placed in her keeping by a young man who had trusted her. He thought of Basil Trent's speech, with its laughing reference to things locked in and buried, A man reminding people, publicly, confidently, that he held all the relevant cards. And then he thought of a woman who had spent 11 years being overlooked in a house that had destroyed someone she cared for, while the people responsible arranged their lives around her, as though she were a piece of furniture. "Miss Vale," said Poirot, with a gentleness that was entirely genuine, "you are frightened." She met his eyes. "I am not frightened for myself," she said. "I have not been frightened for myself for quite some time." She picked up the botanical encyclopedia and opened it again. "That," she said quietly, "is rather the difficulty." She resumed reading. Poirot sat for a moment longer, then rose, replaced his chair precisely as he had found it, and left the library. In the corridor, he stood quite still for nearly a minute, his eyes focused on nothing in particular, while the little grey cells did what they did best. By the time he reached the foot of the staircase, the picture was almost complete. One or two details remained. The contents of those glass bottles, the question of the key, the matter of who had stood in the maze shadow at midnight. Small things. Poirot was not troubled by small things. Small things in his experience had a way of clarifying themselves at the appropriate moment, provided one had first understood the large ones. He understood the large ones now. Chapter 7. The Punchline. The coroner's report arrived at 3 o'clock in the afternoon by special messenger, which meant that Inspector Graves arrived at 4, and that Lady Imogen spent the intervening hour rearranging the flowers in the hall with an intensity that had moved some distance beyond horticulture. The report was, in its careful language, suggestive rather than conclusive. Cardiac arrest, confirmed. Contributing factors, under investigation. The presence of taxine alkaloids in the preliminary blood analysis was noted with the particular understatement that official documents reserve for findings that carry considerable implications. It was, in effect, the coroner's way of saying, "This man was poisoned, and I should prefer to say so quietly while the relevant parties absorb the information." Graves read it twice, said "Good Lord" at a volume that carried through the morning-room door, and then collected himself and asked to speak with Poirot, alone. They met in the library. The library, again, which seemed to Poirot to have appointed itself the room where the truth of the house was reluctant, with the expression of a man re-evaluating a weekend. "That's you, isn't it?" "It is. The berries, the leaves, the bark, all contain it in varying concentrations. It acts upon the heart. Given in sufficient quantity and in the appropriate preparation, it would produce cardiac symptoms that might, in a man already known to have a weak heart, appear entirely consistent with natural causes." Poirot paused. It would require knowledge, patience, and access to the plant material in question, which we have, apparently, in abundance. Graves set down the report and looked at Poirot with the direct regard of a man who has decided that the Belgian is less of a complication than he initially appeared. "You knew." "I suspected. There is a distinction, mon ami, though it is sometimes a fine one." "How long?" "Since I examined Monsieur Tran's hands on the morning of his death. The soil under the nails and the expression on his face told me that he had not come to the gate by accident. He had been brought there deliberately, and he had understood what was happening with sufficient time to be frightened, but insufficient time to prevent it." Poirot looked at the pristine blotter. "The garden did the rest. The paths ensure that someone standing at the gate cannot be observed from the house. The maze ensures that approaching footsteps cannot be easily distinguished from the ordinary movements of the night. It is, as Monsieur Dane so correctly observed, a very well calculated composition. Graves was quiet for a moment. You'll want to see it through yourself. The revelation. It was not quite a question, and Poirot answered it with a slight inclination of his head that conveyed gratitude for the professional courtesy. If you would permit it, yes. There are one or two things that remain to be confirmed, and I find that the drawing together of threads is best accomplished. He considered the word. Theatrically. Tonight? Dinner, I think. At 8 o'clock, as usual. He permitted himself a small smile. Some things, whatever the circumstances, ought to be conducted with the proper ceremony. He spent the afternoon in 3 final conversations, each brief, each surgical. The first was with Dr. Harrow. Poirot found him in his room, already packed, and informed him quietly that departing would be both inadvisable and, in due course, rather difficult to explain. Harrow sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the floor and said, with the exhaustion of a man who has been maintaining a position under considerable strain, "I didn't know she intended to kill him." "No," said Poirot. "I believe that. But you knew about the building beyond the gate." Harrow looked up. "I'm the family physician. I've been managing Lady Imogen's garden ailments for 30 years. Cuts, stings, the occasional case of contact dermatitis. I knew she kept plant specimens there. I assumed—" He stopped. "I chose to assume it was botanical interest. And when you examined Trent, his colour was wrong." The words came with the clipped self-condemnation of a man delivering a verdict against himself. The extremities, the rhythm of the heart before it failed. I knew, when I found him, that there was a question. I said heart because... He turned to look out the window at the garden he would not now be leaving. "Because I have been saying what Lady Imogen required me to say for 30 years. And some habits are more deeply grooved than one realizes." Poirot left him there. There was no comfort available that would have been honest. The second conversation was with Celia Trent, and it was the shortest. He asked her one thing only: whether Edmund Hawthorn's document, placed in her keeping before his death, was still in her possession. She went to her travelling case and produced from within a sealed envelope, brown with age, which she held out to him without comment. Her expression contained the particular relief of someone setting down a weight they have carried so long they had forgotten its original purpose. "I kept it," she said, "because I didn't know what to do with it. And then I kept it because Basil found out I had it, and I knew that producing it would serve as confirmation of what he already understood about my connection to Edmund. And then I kept it because—" She shook her head. "Because it was all that remained of him, and I was not yet ready to give it to the world." Poirot placed the envelope carefully inside his breast pocket. "It will serve its purpose now," he said. "He will be heard." She did not reply, but she stood a little straighter when he left the room. The third conversation was the one he had been considering since the library. He knocked at the door of Miss Vale's small room on the upper corridor, smaller than the guest rooms, commensurate with her position in the household. And when she opened it, why, he regarded her for a moment with an attention that was both kind and absolute. "I know what you did," he said, "and I know why. Before this evening, I wanted you to know that I know both." She held his gaze. "And?" And I wish to ask you one thing." He paused. "The night you heard the gate, the sound of metal in the dark, you knew then what was happening." Something moved across her face. Not guilt, not defiance, but something older and less easily named. "I thought I knew," she said carefully. "I had observed enough to understand what had been prepared. But knowing what someone is capable of is not the same as knowing they will act." She paused. "And I believed, perhaps, that he deserved to be frightened, that there was justice in his fear, even if not in what followed." "But it did follow." "Yes," she said, "it did." She met his eyes without flinching. He had seen, in many years of this work, the eyes of people who had done terrible things for ignoble reasons. The eyes before him were different, not innocent, not untroubled, but the eyes of someone who had been brought, by long and lonely stages, to a place she had not entirely intended to reach. He thought of Edmund's envelope in his pocket. He thought of 11 years. "Tonight," he said, "dinner. Will you come?" "I have," said Miss Prudence Vale, "always come to dinner." She closed the door quietly, and Poirot stood in the corridor for a moment, looking at the worn runner of carpet that stretched the length of the upper hall. At the end of it, the window admitted the long, horizontal light of late afternoon. And in that light, and every thread of the carpet was individually distinct. The faded red, the worn gold, the places where the pattern had been walked away almost entirely, so that what remained was something simpler than it had begun. He went to dress for dinner. Tonight, the threads would be drawn together, and what they made would be plain to everyone present. It would not, he reflected, be a comfortable picture, but comfort and truth were not, in his experience, reliable companions, and of the two, he had always known which he preferred. Chapter 8. The Arrangement. They assembled at 8 o'clock with the punctuality of people who have nothing left to pretend about except punctuality. Poirot had asked Graves to remain in the house. Unobtrusively, in the corridor adjacent to the dining room, though the door left 3 inches open in the manner of a thing done carelessly rather than with intent. Graves had agreed with the professional stoicism of a man who has decided to trust a process he does not entirely understand. The footman, Higgins, had been asked to serve and then absent himself. He had complied with the relief of a young man who has understood, at some level, that proximity to what was about to occur was not in his interests. The dining room was lit as it had been on the first evening. Candles, the good silver, the disciplined flowers. Lady Imogen had seen to this herself. Whatever else she was, she maintained standards, and Poirot had been sufficiently acquainted with her by now to understand that the maintenance of standards was not vanity so much as the last coherent structure in a life that was quietly coming apart. He had arranged the seating with care. Lady Imogen at the head, as always. Dr. Harrow to her left, where he had always sat. Celia Trent opposite him. Oliver Dane at the far end, a position that suited his tendency to observe rather than engage at close quarters. And Miss Vale beside Poirot himself, at the midpoint of the table, which placed her precisely where everyone could see her, and almost no one had ever thought to look. One chair remained empty, Basil's chair, which Lady Imogen had not removed. Poirot did not remove it either. The first course was consumed in the particular silence of people waiting for someone else to begin. Oliver Dane made one remark about the soup, which was accurate and entirely ignored. Dr. Harrow did not refill his wineglass, which Poirot noted as a man marshalling himself, and Lady Imogen ate with great precision and looked at no one. Poirot set down his spoon. "I am grateful to you all," he said in a tone of mild conversational warmth, "for indulging an old man's preference for a proper table. One thinks so much more clearly when the setting is correct." He looked around at them with the expression of someone who has just remembered a mildly interesting story. "I have been thinking, you see, about gardens." Oliver Dane looked up. "Specifically," said Poirot, "about the way in which a garden can be made to mean whatever its designer intends. The paths tell you where to walk. The sightlines tell you what to see. The locked gate tells you that there is something beyond it that is not your concern. All of this operates—" he picked up his wineglass. "Below the level of conscious attention. One follows the paths because they are there. One avoids the gate because it is locked. The garden, one might say, manages its visitors." "This is a very philosophical soup course," said Oliver Dane. "Bear with me, mon ami. I arrive always at the point." Poirot set down his glass. "This particular garden was designed, as we know, by you. The sightlines, the paths, the configuration of the maze, all calculated, as you yourself described it to me, with great precision. What you did not design, however, or at least what you did not intend, was the use to which those calculations were subsequently put." Dane was still. "What use?" "The use of concealment. The maze paths ensure that anyone standing at the gate cannot be observed from the house. This was not your intention. It was, however, a very useful property. Useful enough that someone spent some years making quiet use of it." He looked gently toward the head of the table. "The building beyond the gate, Lady Imogen, has been your laboratory, has it not, for some considerable time?" The silence was of a different quality now. Celia Trent placed her hands in her lap. Dr. Harrow looked at the table. Lady Imogen said, "That is an extraordinary thing to suggest." "It is," agreed Poirot cheerfully. "And yet there the bottles are, and there the plant material, and there, in the coroner's preliminary report, is the taxine. English yew. Extraordinarily common in English gardens, as I had occasion to remark to myself only yesterday." He paused. "You have been studying the properties of garden plants for a long time, I think. Not with any immediate purpose, or as one studies many things that later become relevant. You are a methodical woman, madame. It is one of your most consistent qualities." "Stephen," Lady Imogen's voice had not changed in register or volume. "You said cardiac arrest." "I said it was consistent with cardiac arrest," said Harrow without looking up. "I have been saying with great care things that were technically accurate for rather longer than I am proud of." He raised his eyes. "The coroner will not be as careful as I have been." Lady Imogen looked at him for a long moment with the expression of someone recalibrating, at some speed, the architecture of an alliance. Then she turned back to Poirot, and something in her face, not softened exactly, but simplified, let go of its final performance. He was going to destroy everything, she said, not defensively, factually, in the manner of a woman submitting an account. Basil had maintained his silence for 4 years, and then Edmund's document resurfaced. Her eyes moved briefly to Celia, who did not look away. "He telephoned me the week before the party. He said the terms of the arrangement required revision, that his continued discretion about Edmund's death and about the estate accounts would require a considerably more substantial expression of gratitude than he had hitherto accepted. She lifted her chin. He said it with that laugh of his, 3 seconds before he had even finished the sentence. "So you invited him here," said Poirot. "I invited him here. I had everything prepared. It required only the opportunity." She looked quite directly at the empty chair. "He made it easy. He always needed an audience for his moments of power. When I suggested a private conversation at the gate—" She stopped. "He came at once. He couldn't resist." "And the conversation?" "Was brief. I had the preparation in his wine-glass before we reached the gate. He had drunk it at the table. By the time we were in the maze, he knew something was wrong. He was frightened." She said this without triumph and without remorse, simply. "He had time to be frightened, and then he was dead, and I walked back through the gate and locked it and returned to the house and went to bed." The candles had burned lower. The room was smaller than it had been. "There is one thing more," said Poirot, with a quietness that the room attended to completely. He reached into his breast pocket and placed Edmund's envelope on the table. "Your son's document. He gave it to Celia for safekeeping before he died. It has been in existence throughout the 4 years of Basil's arrangement, which means that the arrangement was, from its inception, without foundation. Basil did not possess the only copy of the truth." He paused. "He possessed only the threat of it. The document was always there. Edmund's account was always there. It required only the courage to produce it." Lady Imogen looked at the envelope for a very long moment. Something moved across her face that was neither the controlled fury he had observed at breakfast 3 days ago, nor the administrative composure with which she had greeted her guest's death. It was something older and less managed, and he suspected it had not been visible in this room for a considerable number of years. "Edmund," she said. "Only that. Only his name." In the corridor, Poirot heard Graves shift his weight. He rose from the table, and what had been, for 3 evenings, a performance of a household in the ordinary business of living finally and completely came to its end. Chapter 9. The Last Dinner. Inspector Graves entered the dining room with the measured tread of a man who has rehearsed his entrance and found it adequate. He said what was required to be said to Lady Imogen in the formal language of his office, and she received it standing, which Poirot thought was exactly what one would have predicted of her, and was perhaps the most genuinely dignified thing he had witnessed in this house. She asked for 5 minutes to collect certain items from her room. Graves granted them with a nod, and positioned the young constable he had brought in the corridor outside her door. The Lady Imogen walked past the constable without acknowledging his existence, which was also, Poirot reflected, exactly what one would have predicted. The dining room, in her absence, did not relax. It simply became a different kind of tense. Oliver Dane poured himself the wine he had not drunk during dinner and sat with it without drinking it. Celia Trent remained at the table with her hands folded and her eyes on Edmund's envelope, which still lay where Poirot had placed it. Dr. Harrow had not moved at all. He sat with the stillness of a man conducting a thorough and unflattering internal audit. Miss Vale had not moved either. She sat at Poirot's right with her hands in her lap, and her gaze directed at a point on the tablecloth 6 inches in front of her. And Poirot had the impression, not for the first time, of a woman who has done a thing she cannot undo and has made her peace with exactly that fact, and not 1 inch beyond it. Poirot remained at the table. He had more to say. When Lady Imogen returned, composed, her hair arranged, wearing her coat with the precision of a woman who intended to be taken nowhere that she had not dressed appropriately for, Poirot rose and asked, with great courtesy, for a further 15 minutes before she departed with the inspector. Graves looked at him. Poirot looked at Graves. Graves checked his watch and said that 15 minutes was agreeable. Lady Imogen sat at the head of the table for the last time. "There is," said Poirot, resuming his chair and addressing the room in the mildest possible tone, "a second account to be given. Lady Imogen's we have heard. It is truthful as far as it extends. But there are questions it does not answer, and I find I cannot, in good conscience, allow them to remain unanswered in a room where everyone present has some knowledge of the truth, and is using that knowledge to shield themselves from the rest of it." No one spoke. The candles had burned very low. "Monsieur Dane," said Poirot, "you were in the garden on the night of Basile's death. You have said you saw nothing. I believe this to be accurate so far as it goes. You saw no person, but you heard the gate, did you not? Sometime around midnight." Dane set down his untouched wine. "A sound," he said. "I thought it was an animal." "You did not think it was an animal," said Poirot, without particular emphasis. "You recognize the sound. You have spent a great many hours in this garden, and you know its sounds as well as its sight lines. But you also had reasons of your own to be in that garden at night that you had no wish to disclose, and so you chose the simplest available explanation and remained with it." Dane looked at the tablecloth. "I wasn't doing anything." "No, you were simply walking, angry perhaps, rehearsing your grievances as one does. There is no crime in that." Poirot's tone was entirely without judgment. "But you heard the gate, and you chose not to investigate, and that choice is yours to live with. I mention it not to condemn, but because the complete record should be complete." Dane said nothing. He nodded once at the tablecloth. Poirot turned to Dr. Harrow. "You have already, I think, conducted your own reckoning this evening. There is nothing I can say to you that you have not said more clearly to yourself in the last 2 hours. But there is a question of Edmund." Harrow looked up. "You were the family physician when he died," said Poirot. "You examined him at the foot of those stairs. You gave your professional opinion that the fall was the cause of death, and that there were no complicating factors." He paused. Were there complicating factors? A very long silence, the kind that occupies a room completely. "He had been given a sedative," said Harrow at last, "a significant one. Enough to explain why a young man in reasonable health might miss his footing on a familiar staircase in the dark. He said it with the flatness of a man who has been carrying a sentence for 4 years, and has now, at considerable cost, set it down. I noted it. I said nothing. I told myself it could have been self-administered." He looked at Lady Imogen, who was looking at the wall. I told myself that for a long time." The wall offered Lady Imogen nothing. "Edmund," said Poirot to the room generally, "did not fall by accident. He was helped. The document he had prepared, the account of the estate's financial irregularities, and of the arrangement by which Lady Imogen had maintained the fiction of solvency, posed a threat she could not permit. She had removed inconvenient things before. She removed Edmund. He said it plainly, without theatre. Basil Trent, who knew something of the financial matters and suspected rather more, understood this, and used his understanding to bind himself to the family in a manner that proved, for 4 years, financially advantageous. He folded his hands, until it ceased to be advantageous and became something else. Celia Trent said, in a voice very nearly steady, "Edmund knew he was in danger." "Yes. He told me he thought—" She stopped. "He didn't say it directly. He said he'd written everything down and given it to me because he didn't entirely trust his own shelves." A brief, painful sound that was not quite a laugh. "He made a joke of it. He was like that." Poirot nodded. He allowed the room a moment with this. With Edmund's joke, with the young man who had made it, with the long years during which no one had listened to the dead. Then he turned to Miss Vale. She had been waiting. He could see that she had been waiting from the moment he began. "Miss Vale," he said, "you knew that Lady Imogen killed Edmund." "I suspected," she said precisely. "I had no proof. I had observation, inference, and the knowledge that no one in this house would have credited the observations of a paid companion over the word of its mistress. And when you discovered the building beyond the gate, the preparation of the toxin, you knew what was being planned." "I knew that Basil had made his telephone call," she said. "I was in the hall. I heard Lady Imogen's side of it. Her voice, when she controls herself most completely, carries further than she realizes." A pause. "I knew what she intended." The room was absolutely still. "You did not go to the police," said Poirot. "No." "You did not warn Basil?" "No." She met his eyes without wavering. "Basil Trent destroyed Edmund. He held the knowledge of Edmund's murder over this family for 4 years, and he profited from it. And he sat at that table." Her gaze moved to the empty chair. "And laughed about locked gates and buried things. He was not an innocent man placed in danger. He was a man who had made very specific choices and arrived by their logic at a very specific destination. And yet you might have prevented it." "Yes," said Miss Vale, "I might have." She said it without qualification, without the softening that most people apply in such moments to the edges of the unacceptable. Poirot looked at her for a long moment, at the grey eyes, the folded hands, the entire composed economy of a woman who had been reduced to near invisibility by a world that found her negligible, and who had in the end chosen, once, not to intervene. "You did not kill him," said Poirot at last. "You are not guilty of the crime before this inquiry. But you are not without responsibility, and you know it. And I think you will know it for the rest of your life, without requiring me to tell you." "Yes," said Miss Vale in the same clear voice. "I will." Graves stepped fully into the room. Lady Imogen rose from the head of the table for the last time, and walked out of the dining room ahead of him, and did not look back. The candles went on burning. No one moved to snuff them. Outside, a car started. Its sound grew smaller, and then was gone. And what remained was the house, the garden, the darkness, and 5 people sitting in silence around a table with one chair empty and an old brown envelope at its centre, and the weight of everything that had been done and left undone, settling over all of them like the particular stillness that follows, always, when the performance is finally over. Chapter 10. Daylight. The morning came as English mornings always do, with a complete indifference to what the previous night had contained. The sun arrived at 6:30 over the yew hedge. The roses, disciplined into their customary perfection, collected the light and distributed it with the equanimity of things that have no opinions about the events of human households. The locked gate at the far end of the maze was still locked. The padlock on the stone building beyond it had been removed by Graves the previous evening, replaced by an official notice that no one would read, but which served its function of transforming a private concealment into a public record. Poirot stood at the drawing-room window with a cup of coffee, passable, not excellent, and looked at the garden for some time. He was not, as those who knew him only superficially sometimes assumed, immune to the particular weight of a conclusion. The solving of a thing did not empty it. He had understood this for many years, in the way one understands those things that experience teaches without quite announcing. That the moment the truth becomes clear is not a moment of lightness, but of gravity, because the truth, once visible, cannot be made otherwise, and all that attends it, the waste, the long damage, the years people spend constructing elaborate architectures around an original wrong, becomes visible simultaneously. Edmund Hawthorn had been dead for 4 years. He had been, by all accounts, a gentle and principled young man who had the misfortune to be the son of a woman to whom principle was a concept subordinate to continuity. He had tried to do the right thing and had been helped down a staircase in the dark for his trouble, and the world had noted his passing, expressed its regrets, and moved efficiently onward. Poirot drank his coffee and gave Edmund Hawthorn the minute of honest consideration that 4 years of official silence had denied him. Then he set down his cup with precision and went to find what remained of the household. It had diminished considerably. Dr. Harrow had departed at first light, leaving a note for Poirot that contained 3 sentences and no salutation. The first acknowledged what he had done and failed to do. The second stated that he had already written to the relevant medical authorities. The third said only that he hoped Edmund's account would receive the attention it deserved. It was, Poirot thought, the most honest document Harrow had produced in 30 years, and it had cost him everything, and he had written it anyway. There was something in that worth acknowledging. Oliver Dane was in the morning room drinking tea and sketching in his leather-bound notebook with the concentrated industry of a man who has processed the previous evening by converting it immediately into composition. He looked up when Poirot entered with the expression of someone who has been rehearsing a remark. "I should have spoken earlier," he said, "about what I heard that night." "Yes," said Poirot, without elaboration. Dane looked at his sketch. "I was angry. I've been angry about this garden for 3 years, and it made me selective about what I attended to." He paused. "That's not an excuse." "No," agreed Poirot pleasantly. "But it is an explanation, which is a different thing. Explanations are useful. They tell us how we arrived at a place. They do not, however, tell us where to go next." He looked at the sketch, which appeared to be the maze rendered in clean, spare lines, stripped of its ornamental complexity and reduced to something more honest. "That is rather good." Dane looked at it. "It is what the maze actually is," he said, "without the performance." Poirot left him to it. Celia Trent was in the garden. She was standing near the herbaceous border where Poirot had found her 2 days previously, but her posture was different now. Less the posture of someone holding something in, more the posture of someone learning what it feels like to stand without a weight they had grown accustomed to carrying. The gloves on this occasion were on her hands. She heard him approach and turned without alarm. The careful composure of their previous conversations had not disappeared, but it had changed in quality, the way a room changes when a window is opened. "The envelope has been passed to Graves," said Poirot. "Edmund's account will be examined by the appropriate people. There will be proceedings, I think, beyond Lady Imogen's arrest. The financial matters are not simple." "They never were." She looked toward the hedge beyond which the maze was invisible but present. "I should have produced it years ago, I know that." "You were afraid." "I was afraid," she confirmed. "And I think I was also waiting for someone to ask me, which is a cowardly thing to say." "Perhaps. Or perhaps you needed the question before you could give the answer. Some people require to be asked." He stood beside her and looked at the border, which was, he noticed for the first time, planted with an attention to colour and sequence that suggested considerable knowledge. "You planted this?" She blinked. "Yes, over several years. Lady Imogen thought she was directing it, but she lost interest after the first season." A pause that contained something almost like warmth. "She was not, in the end, as interested in the garden as she was in what the garden represented. Whereas you were interested in the garden. Whereas I was interested in the garden." They stood for a moment in a silence that was, for the first time in Poirot's experience of this house, uncomplicated. "What will you do?" he asked. "I don't know yet." She said it without distress, with the mild, wondering tone of someone encountering, for the first time in a while, a future that belongs entirely to them. "I haven't had to decide that for some time." Poirot left her to the border. Miss Vale was in the corridor outside the library, wearing her coat and carrying a single small case, when he found her. She was not waiting for him. She was waiting for the car that would take her to the station, and she had come downstairs at the precise time required, and not a moment earlier, which was entirely consistent with everything he had observed of her. They regarded each other in the corridor with the mutual attention of two people who have understood each other rather completely, and are now navigating the question of what to do with that understanding. "You will be all right," said Poirot. It was not a question, and it was not reassurance. It was an observation delivered with the same quality of direct attention he had been applying to the inhabitants of this house for 4 days. "Yes," she said, "I expect I will." "The world is full of people," said Poirot thoughtfully, "who are not seen. This is a very great waste of the world's resources, and it is an error that compounds itself, because people who are not seen learn to be less visible still, and then they are seen even less, and so it continues." He tilted his head in the manner of a man arriving at a conclusion that has been forming for some time. "You are not seen here. You were not seen for 11 years. And in the absence of being seen, you were left with only your own judgment as a guide, without the corrective that other people provide when they attend to us." He paused. "I do not say this to excuse what was not done. I say it because I think you know it, and I think you deserve to have someone say it aloud." Miss Vale looked at him for a moment with those grey, entirely alert eyes. Then she said, in a tone that was not quite dry and not quite tender, "You are a very peculiar man, Monsieur Poirot." "So I have been told," he agreed, with some regularity. The car arrived. She picked up her case and paused at the door. "He was kind," she said without turning. "Edmund. He was the only person in this house in 11 years who ever asked me what I thought about something and then actually listened to the answer." A beat. I thought you should know that about him." She went out to the car, and it took her away down the drive. Hercule Poirot stood in the doorway of Hawthorn Grange and watched until it was gone. Then he turned back to the house. Behind him, the garden sat in its summer perfection, the roses composed and immaculate, the hedges trimmed with unaltered severity, the yew mays patient and precise. The locked gate at its end was locked still, and the empty stone building beyond it waited for whatever official attention it would now receive. In the dining room, he knew, another seating chart was somewhere in a drawer. Another luncheon would be arranged or not arranged. The house would be dealt with, in time, by courts and solicitors, and the long administrative machinery that processes the wreckage of lives conducted at a certain scale. One chair would remain empty. Lord Poirot collected his hat and his coat and his perfectly aligned travelling case from the hall, and he stood for a moment in the entrance of Hawthorn Grange and addressed, briefly and without illusion, the portraits of the grim ancestors on the walls. "They do not see one another," he said to no one in particular. "That is their tragedy." The ancestors offered no response. They rarely did. He stepped out into the daylight, where the June morning continued its complete indifference, and the car that would take him back to London and order and the precise alignment of his own affairs was waiting at the end of the drive with an engine running and not a moment to waste. Hercule Poirot settled his hat, squared his shoulders, and did not look back.